This week on Newsmakers, J.B. Poersch, the Senate Majority PAC president, here to talk about Senate Democrats' efforts to defend 23 states up for the vote in 2018. Thank you, sir, for being here. In studio with us, we also have Sean Sullivan of the Washington Post, political reporter, and Alex Warty, political reporter for McClatchy Newspapers. Welcome to the two of you. Sean Sullivan with the first question.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, JB, for being with us. I want to start with a question about something that's in the news squarely this week. The president's comments on the deadly violence in Charlottesville have been roundly condemned by both Democrats and many Republicans. Will Senate Majority PAC seek to remind voters as we move closer to the midterm elections about the remarks that he made this week? And if so, how soon can we start to potentially see an investment in making that argument?
Good morning. Thanks for having me. The president's comments were a disturbing reaction to what happened in Charlottesville. And I think former Vice President Biden said it well. There's only one side. There can only be one side, and that we needed to stand up against hate, against bigotry, against white supremacists. I suspect that these will be issues in the campaign. The president has already made it clear that he has a different view on it. I suspect that we'll see it first in Republican primaries, that there are clear divisions that I think are going to be brought out in several primaries that are going to exist all over the country. We'll probably shortly talk about as many as 6, 7, 8 Republican primaries, and I think that's the likely first place where you're going to hear and see some of these divisions.
JB, is there any hesitation about using Trump's words in ads? I know it's early yet in the election cycle, but just in the last election cycle, there was such a heavy focus on Donald Trump, then candidate Trump. And, obviously the Democratic Party did not have the election that they had hoped to last year. And there was some talk afterward that there was too much of a focus on Trump then and not enough of a focus on the Republicans, the congressional Republicans.
Yeah, though ironically that happened more at the presidential level. I think in Senate races last cycle, we recognized early on that the president was defined for many voters as a change element and in fact didn't weigh in on races in quite the same way. That said, there was no escaping the presidential race. I think it's a little early to tell what the president's impact and how he's part of the campaign. I think, as you know, when you go from cycle to cycle, you have to be careful not to fight the same war. And I suspect that the president's eroding job approval tells us that the failure to move his agenda is likely to be an issue, and he's likely to be part of the campaign as well.
Steve Bannon, the White House chief strategist, just said to a couple of reporters that as long as Democrats are talking about race identity politics, we win. And I'm paraphrasing here, but agree, disagree?
And whether he said it on the record or off the record is part of it too. This is broader than just race. It's the divisions in the country. I don't agree with him. I think that most Americans are horrified by what happened in Charlottesville. I think that most Americans want to have a conversation about moving forward, about uniting, and if that's what the campaign's about, I think we're on good ground.
The president's also inserting himself to varying degrees in some of these Republican primaries, as you mentioned, including Arizona, where Jeff Flake is running for re-election. President on Twitter seeming to suggest or indicate support for Kelly Ward, Jeff Flake's primary challenger. How do you guys see the landscape there, and do you plan to potentially try to influence the outcome of that primary, as we've seen in past elections where, say Democrat Claire McCaskill, last time she ran, was able to influence the outcome of the Republican primary to her advantage? Could we see something similar from you guys in Arizona?
Well, a year and a quarter out, we're going to have to make a lot of decisions about right steps. We're interested in winning, and we do what we need to in order to win. That said, there's an awful lot that's going to have to play out in Arizona. I'm not even sure I can tell you who would be our best opponent right now. Senator Flake starts with egregiously low job numbers, I think lower than we normally see for an incumbent. I could say something similar about Dean Eller in Nevada. He's in a precarious place where he seems to be trying to find a strategic way to say that he's more conservative than Donald Trump. I think that's going to be a hard place. We don't even know if we're seeing all the Republican candidates in at this point. As you know, there are rumors of other candidates that might get in. As of this taping, it looks like the president is siding with Kelly Ward. She would be an interesting candidate for the Republicans to rally behind, and I would imagine the progress the Democrats have made in Arizona. Remember that 6 years ago, we only lost in Arizona by just 3 points. Hillary Clinton was 3 points shy in the state as well. This is a state that grows more Democratic, and I expect will be a very good opportunity for us.
What about in Alabama? Roll Call's Nathan Gonzalez has changed the rating for that special election from solidly Republican to a toss-up, saying the polarizing potential nominee of Roy Moore could give Democrats a shot at takeover. Will your group spend money in Alabama?
This is obviously a tough target. I think it's fair to call it a long shot. That said, if you look at the dynamic that's played out in the House special election so far, where you've seen energized Democratic base, that usually turns out at a higher level, and you've seen a higher performance in arguably hard states like Georgia and South Carolina. I imagine that'll play out in Alabama. That race in the general won't be until December, so we have a long way before we have to make decisions. Democrats have a particularly good candidate, the former federal attorney in Jones, and I expect that he'll have a real candidacy. It's a little too early to see how this is going to play, but
are you open to the idea?
We're open to the idea. Anywhere we have an opportunity to win, we're going to give that a hard look.
Does Roy Moore have to be the nominee for you to possibly spend there?
I think both former Judge Moore and Senator Strange seem to have ethical challenges. I think they both have hurdles to climb. I wouldn't say that Moore has to be the candidate. No, I think we'll have to watch. I expect that the next 30 days are going to be very competitive between both of them. I guess I would expect that Senator Strange is a bit of a favorite in it, given the institutional support that he's already getting, given the financial support that he's giving. But look, Moore was outspent 10-1 and still won the first round. So that's going to be a fun one to watch.
When you look at some of the public polling we've seen in the last few months, it seems like a few things are clear. One, the president is very unpopular. His popularity seems to decline. But I think another thing that we've seen is that Democrats are pretty unpopular too, and the Democratic Party is very unpopular right now, and voters seem to not have a clear sense of what the party stands for. So I want to ask you, one, why you think that is, and two, will Senate Majority PAC be doing anything to try to shore up the image of the party or clarify for voters what it is this party stands for, aside from just opposing Trump?
Yeah, I think both parties have shown erosion. Clearly, the Democratic Party has room to grow in the eyes of American voters. I'll say as an aside that where you can see disappointing job numbers in both parties, you still see an advantage for Democrats going into this election in most generic ballots, whether it's the House or in general. That said, we have a ways to grow as a party. I think more of a laser focus on the economy is crucial. I'm encouraged by the steps that the Senate caucus has shown for a proactive strategy that's focused on economic issues. That's something we support. It's something in early television and digital that we've tried to echo. And some of our advertising. So we play a role, and hopefully this is all a step in the right direction.
JB, are you at all concerned? I mean, there is so much energy in the activist left right now. We've seen it in the Women's March, and that has really continued, including in some of the special elections you mentioned. Are you worried at all that not everyone, though, on the Democratic Party or in the liberal movement is on the same page? That you could face primaries, that you could have liberals who demand that Democratic candidates embrace something like single-payer health care. How much of a concern is that for you?
Well, divisive primaries, at least in Senate races, doesn't look to be likely. There are a couple of situations we'll have to watch. I'm sure at the House level there'll be a little bit of a concern. I'm just as concerned that the Democratic establishment doesn't listen to an activist base and learn from it. I think this is a really important opportunity for us to come together. I think people are still obviously smarting from the results of the last election, but moreover where we are as a country and where we're headed. And I think we got to come together and make smart steps so that we're winning next November.
Along those same lines, there's a debate in the Democratic Party right now about whether a candidate's position on abortion should be a litmus test for supporting that candidate. Is that something that you guys will look at when you look at different Senate races that you may or may not play in? Should a Democratic candidate's stance on abortion be a litmus test in your view?
Well, most of our candidates are pro-choice. There are a couple of exceptions that happen. We're going to stay focused on the candidate's agenda. I think you'll see that the party will stay united. It's a big tent.
Let me ask you about another issue I mentioned just a little bit ago: single-payer health care. There are a lot of liberals who look at this as a key to energizing the Democratic base. There are strategists I talk to who are worried because, we've been through a healthcare fight before, and politically speaking, it didn't work out so well for us. Where do you stand on that issue?
I think that with single payer, I think it's an issue that we'll have a strong debate about in 2019 and 2020. I would expect that we'll have a number of candidates that'll be running for president 2-3 years from now. I imagine single payer will be part of the debate. I think what's in front of us now is where we are with ACA, and I think more urgently or alarmingly, I don't have any reason to believe that we won't have future votes in the Senate. I think that's what the president wants. I think there'll be real pressure on McConnell, and I think that's where the focus is going to be. And taking it a step further, the focus here legislatively is continuing to tear down the system. There was another path. There was an opportunity, I think, for this president and for the Republican majority to talk with Democrats and maybe make the system that we have now better. I think that's a deal still to be had. Doesn't appear to be a real conversation. Those are all things I think that have got to get our focus and energy before we're really sinking our teeth into single payer.
As you look at the Senate map in 2018, it's obviously a very difficult map in general for Democrats. You're defending a lot more seats. You're defending seats in states that Trump won. But given Trump's declining popularity, given that the Democratic base seems to be more energized than ever, is there a potential possibility of taking back the majority, Democrats taking back the Senate majority in 2018?
Well, I think the first thing's true. I think this is a really challenging map. There are 10 states where Donald Trump won at the presidential level, and we're defending 25 states overall where we're defending. So clearly we have our work cut out for us. But certainly, as you've seen in many elections, the environment is often king. And between things we've cited already, the generic ballot and the president's declining job approval, there's reason to believe that even in challenging states like Missouri, like West Virginia, like Indiana, that we can bring back our incumbents. It's encouraging in those states that our senators there are so well defined, most of them well liked. In the polling that I've seen in nearly every situation where we start with a lead, that's pretty encouraging in and of itself. So,
and is this energy showing up in your fundraising efforts?
We're ahead of where we've been in past cycles. I hope we continue to stay in that, and certainly I'm pretty pleased with where our incumbents are. The incumbent fundraising's been particularly strong in places like Ohio and Missouri and Florida, and that's encouraging too.
Let's go through some of the individual races. I mean, do you see someone like Joe Manchin? He's in a state that Donald Trump won by a lot. We'll leave it at that. How is he able to survive when he hasn't, as of yet, he hasn't really been able to cooperate with President Trump on anything?
I think it always starts by the ability of an incumbent to champion the state and the constituency, and almost nobody does it better than Joe Manchin, who is well liked, is popular, both, yes, in terms of the data, but you can see it when you're in West Virginia too. And he's been willing, I think, at times to work with the president, where he's had an opportunity already, passing a significant piece for retired miners on health care that the president supported. I think if he keeps his constituency in front of him, he'll be back in the Senate.
Are there any lessons? Obviously, a presidential election is very different from a midterm cycle, but are there any lessons that you can take away from looking at what happened in 2016, looking at the kind of campaign that Hillary Clinton ran, looking at the campaigns that some of the Senate Democrats ran, that you can apply to next year, and any mistakes that you don't want to repeat or you're actively trying not to repeat?
I agree with what you've heard from Leader Schumer, that we have to keep the economy first. I think that there were times in the last election that we lost sight of how many Americans are still struggling to get by, and that hasn't changed. The economy continues to grow, and yet we haven't seen significant wage growth, and families are going to still want candidates that have their needs in mind. We've got to put the economy first.
When you assess the map, how do you see someone like Bob Casey or Sherrod Brown or Tim Kaine? These are people who, when the year began, I think people thought were set to have potentially really difficult general elections. Now, in some cases, in Brown and Casey's in particular, they've already drawn Republican opponents. But how do you see those races, and have you seen a division at all between races in Pennsylvania and Ohio versus ones in Indiana and Missouri and maybe some more other conservative states?
Well, I go in assuming that all of those races are going to be challenging. Even I want to take Virginia even for granted in that this is a midterm election. Turnout will be different, so I expect competitive elections. That said, you pointed to three particularly well-liked and successful senators in Casey and in Brown and in Tim Kaine. What I believe about Sherrod Brown in Ohio, which is a challenging state where our presidential candidate fell 8 points short, but Sherrod has won here before twice. I think he's been smart about standing up for workers' rights and standing up for an economy that makes sense in Ohio. I like our chances there. I don't suspect that we're going to see much of a difference in the election that we had 6 years ago in Ohio. Same candidates, same flawed candidate on the Republican side. I expect Sherrod will come out of that one.
Which of these races keeps you up most at night? Which ones do you worry about the most right now?
Well, obviously they're all challenging. Those first five in so-called deeper red states are obviously ones that we stay focused on. That said, initial polling was encouraging because of how well defined Manchin, Heidi Heitkamp, Tester, Joe Donnelly. In all of these states, these are particularly liked candidates. It's a good place to start. Like I said, they start with leads, so that's encouraging. But challenging states.
Traditionally, midterm elections are seen as referendums on the incumbent president. Obviously, this president is different in many ways than we've seen in any before. Do you expect that tradition to continue? Do you think this is going to be a referendum on President
Well,
Trump?
here's what history shows, that history shows that opposition senators opposite the current president, incumbents in a midterm election, since 1982, only 4 have lost. It's remarkable. It's both Republicans and Democrats. Only 4 incumbents have lost. So can this president overcome history? Well, if he could, part of it is how challenging these states are. And I have to give that credit. But I do think that we're not in the same place that we were a year ago. I think the erosion in the president's approval is significant. We've already talked about the energy in the Democratic base, and I expect you'll see that play out around the country. The president's eroding approval suggests, though, that there is concern with independence. That's going to be an important factor. And even potentially, the Republicans should be concerned about their own turnout abilities in 18. Those are big hurdles, and it's a little early, but that's what the Republicans need to overcome.
It is early. Beyond the president's numbers, though, do you see what could be a wedge issue that works in Democrats' favors, or could be a problem for Democrats?
Well, healthcare is already a wedge issue. It's certainly a timely issue. It certainly was a proving ground for a Republican Party newly in power across the board to show that they really had working families' interests at heart. And I'm not sure what we saw play out in the House or the Senate proved that at all. I think the concern and anger is still real. It was interesting to watch how little support various Republican plans were getting around the country with only so much information. I think there was a concern early on that this seemed more about taking apart the current system without replacing it with anything that seemed to address people's concerns about the quality of care, about the affordability of care. Healthcare is not going away as an issue, and it won't be the only issue on the table, but it's going to be a big part of it.
We have a few minutes left.
What about the Russia investigations? That's obviously consumed a lot of attention here in Washington. But is that an issue that moves voters? Is that an issue you look at and you think that you can use to persuade voters to support Democratic candidates for the Senate in 2018?
I think from listening to voters around the country and looking at data that even the so-called Trump base shows concern about whether our election was whether the Russians, to what degree they were able to impact it. They clearly did have some level of impact. I think going forward, that raises security concerns. I think Americans are concerned about that. I think most Americans are glad that there's an investigation that's going forward looking at it. Clearly, this is something that's had some impact and undermined the president in terms of people viewing his effectiveness. And I don't think there's any escaping it. I think it's an issue. Whether candidates are running on it, I think you'll find that candidates are more focused on the economy. but it's going to be part of the election. It already is.
Let me ask you about something that's been a white whale for Democrats for years, maybe even decades, Texas. It has a Senate race next year. Ted Cruz is running for re-election. The polls show his numbers are maybe a little soft there. Democrats have a candidate, Beto O'Rourke, the congressman from El Paso. Is there any sense that that is a race that could become competitive next year? Is it a race that your group is taking a look at?
I think that a year out, I'd say about Texas what I said about Alabama. I think it's fair to say it's still a long shot. I think Congressman Beto out of El Paso is a really promising candidate. And the fact that he enthusiastically got into this race as early as he did, there is a level of donor interest and activist interest in Texas. I think that the growing Hispanic population, the growth of young people in the state shows promise for Democrats in the long run. Whether we can put Texas on the map this time, I think it's a little early to tell. But again, in this environment, you're going to see a shift, and you're going to see a map that'll continue to change right up to Election Day. Let's see if Texas can be part of it.
J.B. Poersch, Senate Majority PAC President, we thank you for your time. Thank you for being this week's Newsmaker.
Thanks for having me.
And we're back with our reporters, Alex Worty of McClatchy, Sean Sullivan of the Washington Post. Sean, let's begin with what we heard from J.B. Poersch and where they plan to spend the money, the resources for defending Senate Democrats.
Well, I think it's very clear that his top priority is defending the Democrats that are running in states that President Trump won, really, really conservative, leaning areas like Montana, West Virginia, and states like that. But it is interesting that he is seeming to open the door, at least, to potentially investing in Alabama, to potentially investing in Arizona. But I sense a very cautious tone. I sensed, that their priority really is on playing defense because they have a lot more defense to play than they have opportunities to go on offense.
Yeah.
So I heard a guy who's very conscientious of the challenge that Senate Democrats face. And, look, even though I think, and he acknowledges that he probably feels a lot better about it than he did 6 months ago. I don't think he would fully own up to that in public, but I think, I know that's how a lot of Democrats feel right now. And the Alabama Senate race is going to be interesting. He didn't suggest that Roy Moore had to win the nomination for Democrats to compete there. That is the thought of a lot of Democrats because some of his controversial past as a state Supreme Court justice there. But that's going to be a fascinating race because Democrats, like he said, have all this energy. Turnout is way up in their base, but they haven't yet been able to get over the top in any of these special elections, which, like Alabama, have been in conservative areas.
Yeah, and I mean, how do they know that their base is energized and they're going to turn up? I mean, what are they looking at?
Well, I think they're looking at a number of different issues, and I think that's why we didn't hear him necessarily zero in on one. He talked about healthcare. We talked about the Russia investigations. He didn't seem to think that was going to be the thing that really puts him over the top. Mm-hmm. We talked about issues like single payer and things that where there's some level of dispute within the Democratic Party. So it doesn't feel yet that Democrats have found that one thing that they can go to their voters and guarantee that they turn out, because Democrats have not been good at turning out voters in these midterm elections. And so listening to him, it sounds like they're still kind of searching for that thing. They don't know whether it's healthcare, whether it's something else.
Well, Alex Worty, couldn't that one thing be the president? Well,
and he said it, the midterms are a referendum on the president. I think there is still some caution because a lot of the candidates did, especially in House races last year, focus so heavily on President Trump. Obviously, it didn't work out great for them. His comments really reflected a lot of what we see Democratic congressional leadership saying. We need to focus on the economy, and the economy. They rolled out an agenda a few weeks ago trying to make the conversation about that. But it's difficult, you have something like what happened in Charlottesville this weekend. You can't ignore that. A few weeks before that, it was the transgender ban that President Trump very suddenly announced on Twitter. Democrats feel compelled that they have to respond to this. But it kind of takes them away, from what politically, at least, they want to be talking about.
Well, right. I mean, Steve Bannon says, keep on talking about race identity politics. We win every time when Democrats do that. Have they brought Democrats into the trap?
We'll see in this election. I mean, if Democrats can turn out voters, if this is an issue that gets new Democratic voters to turn out, if there are voters out there who look at what the president said about Charlottesville and they say, look, I'm going to go register to vote now, I've never voted in a midterm, then what Mr. Bannon is saying is wrong. But if they don't, then it could be difficult for them. And it's interesting, Alex pointed out his focus, JB's focus on the economy. It's difficult for Democrats to make that argument right now because the metrics that we look at when it comes to the economy, I mean, unemployment numbers, the stock market, these things are looking pretty good, and Trump's already taking credit for those things. So there's an added challenge. If Democrats want to make this election about the economy and center their message on that, they're going to have a difficult time doing it if the economy continues apace.
Alex Wardy, tell our viewers why groups like J.B. Poersch's Senate Majority PAC, why they matter, what role will they play?
Well, they have a lot of money. That's the short answer. Ever since the Citizens United decision, there have been these things called super PACs that have popped up that are basically able to raise money, big money from big donors, and they're able to spend millions of dollars in Senate races. And so as much as the candidates and the campaigns and the parties matter, so too now do these super PACs. And we should mention, sometimes they can be truly independent organizations that are coming from who knows what perspective. JB's a veteran Democratic operative, so at least you can expect that the kinds of ads that he runs are going to be pretty similar to what you see candidates and campaigns use.
He, of course, has a counterpart on the Republican side, but tell us more about J.B. Poersch. I mean, what's his background?
Well, here's somebody who knows campaign politics inside and out, who knows the sort of nitty-gritty of how you compete in these races, how you poll these races, what to advertise on. And a lot of what these super PACs that you're talking about do is basically go after the other side. It's a lot of negative advertising. So he's somebody who's definitely skilled in the arts of attacking Republican candidates, singling out those issues that are less flattering about them. And that's really, I think, the key in some of these Senate races. Can you find that one thing or those one or two things that you could unearth and magnify for voters about Republican candidate X, Y, or Z? And then can you go to the voters and say, here's why this person is not qualified to win another term?
Well, I said he's in simpatico with Democratic leaders. Here's someone who was a top aide for Senator Schumer back when he was running the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee, which is Senate Democrats' political arm. Of course, Senator Schumer is now Leader Schumer for the Democratic Party, so it's a fair bet that those two are of a very like mind when it comes to campaigns.
Alex Warty, Sean Sullivan, thank you for being part of this week's Newsmaker.
Thanks.
Thank you.